This episode is brought to you by Paramount Plus. Ewan McGregor stars as Count Alexander Rostov in A Gentleman in Moscow, the new limited series based on the best-selling novel. Stream it with the Paramount Plus with Showtime plan. Visit ParamountPlus.com to try it free.
Our wives need something from us. We need something from our wives. When that thing is not met, then there's going to be this natural resistance and this friction or tension. But if you push it to the side, well, that's going to make anyone feel like they're unheard. Welcome back to the Husband Coach's Corner. Today, we're talking all about arguments. Now, before I dive too deep into the content, I do want to make you aware of a few things, which is one, if you want to support the show, then you can do so by leaving a comment, a subscription, a rate, whatever it may be, a like. It just helps push this into the algorithms of those podcasting platforms so other people can also catch this. Also, if you find value in the content, then consider sharing the podcast with someone in your own circle. Now, I did get the Patreon page up and running, so you can use the link down in the description of these show notes, whatever it may be. And, if you want to go deeper and grow more in learning how to love your wife, then that is the community for you. And it's at a very low price, right? Let's go ahead and jump into arguing, all right? So arguing is natural in marriage. It just is. Arguing is natural in marriage, but we tend to believe that you have a better marriage if you're not arguing. And unfortunately, that's not true, because anyone who has ever been married has argued before. Now, learning when to argue is really an art form, and it's a delicate toe tap, if you will, because not everything requires an argument. And sometimes a disagreement can be considered an argument, even though it's just a disagreement and you're just saying, hey, I don't agree with that. But depending on how your wife takes it, or if you're a husband and your wife is taking or saying something or doing something, you may take that as you need to argue with her, or whatever it may be. All right. It's a perception type of thing. But there is a threshold of when a discussion or a conversation or a disagreement transitions into an argument. And that's what we're going to be talking about today is, one, how to navigate arguments, two, when is the best time to argue, and three, how to identify when an argument is actually taking place. Now, probably not in that order, because I'm just talking to you and not looking at my notes. And every time I do that, I tend to get off track a little bit. So let me get back to my notes. I've already mentioned that arguing is a natural part of a relationship. It's a natural part of marriage. It's a natural thing. Okay. I want to demystify for anyone who's out there thinking like, oh man, if my wife and I argue, then we're doomed. We're not going to be successful. And that's why it's part of the Marriage Success podcast series, because I want you to know that you can be successful. You just have to know how to navigate the arguments and what it is when an argument happens. Now, just because you argue often does not mean that you're destined for divorce or breakup or anything of the sort, all right? I was counseling or coaching a gentleman who he's like, man, me and my wife, we can't seem to not argue. That seems to be the only way we talk to each other. And as counterproductive as this is going to sound, I said, then that's good, because if she wants to argue with you, that means she does want to talk to you. You just have to figure out how to turn your arguments into conversations as opposed to an argument. And that was the true challenge / art form for this gentleman's marriage. And they actually did work it out. So, and it wasn't that she wanted to argue with him. It was that he was misunderstanding some things that she was saying and doing things that probably were not in the best interest of their relationship. And so she let him know about it. And then he would respond with his own feeling, and that became its own thing, right? And that's why they were often arguing. However, she didn't necessarily want to argue. And, I hope that now they're working through whatever issues it was. This was a few years ago, but I hope you get the point. Just because you argue often doesn't mean that you have a bad marriage and that you guys are destined to break up. And that goes without saying that just because you did have an argument that you shouldn't have to worry about going through a divorce. All right. This is normal. It's okay. I think I beat that down into the ground. So I'm just going to skip over. Uh, Actually, I got one more point. Just because you argue doesn't mean you have poor communication skills. All right. My wife and I, we have pretty good communication skills. I think we do. But we argue. We argue to this day. We had an argument a few weeks ago. And that's just the way it is. All right. It's okay. Healthy marriages have arguments. And even effective communicators, which I think that my wife and I are effective at communicating with one another, we still have disagreements. So, what leads to an argument? If you're in this healthy marriage, in this healthy relationship, then what is it that is leading to these arguments? Because that seems to be the question that I've always had. Like, well, if we're so happy together, then why can't we seem to overcome our arguments? And why do we have to have these negative discussions and these things that just make us both angry? Well, it comes down to one thing: an unmet need, or a very drastically misunderstanding of a thing. All right. So let's unpack those two things. So the first one, an unmet need. We all need something. Our wives need something from us. We need something from our wives. When that thing is not met, then there's going to be this natural resistance and this friction or tension. And if that tension isn't resolved in a timely manner or in an appropriate way, then things escalate. And when they escalate, you may not respond or communicate as effectively or as affectionately or loving as you absolutely should. So then that turns into disdain and frustration with the other person, which then leads to the emotional outcome of arguing. Now, it doesn't always happen like that. And sometimes that stuff happens in an instant, right? So let me give you a scenario and then we'll kind of unpack this, all right? You're driving down the road and someone makes a comment about your driving. You respond with, "Hey, don't worry about it. I got this. I'm driving." And then the person in the passenger seat, your spouse, will say something along the lines of, "Well, if I were driving, then I wouldn't have done that. I wouldn't have done it like this. I would have done it like this." And then you say, "Well, that's okay. You don't have to worry about it because I'm the one that's driving." And in that exchange, just know that something is happening there, okay? The tension is building. And if you continue down that path, that tension is going to continue building until you get to a point where I call it the tipping point, right? And that's when the argument begins because someone's anger or frustration exceeds what they could bear, and then they have to let it out. And they usually let it out in a verbal retaliation of some sort. And then voices start to get raised and the situation escalates, right? Now, if you resolve that earlier on and just be like, "Hey, yeah, you know what? You're right. But I'm going to just do it this way because I'm driving right now. And, maybe next time I'll do it your way." All right. So what was the unmet need in this scenario? Well, the unmet need comes from your spouse sitting in the passenger seat. He or she wanted to be acknowledged that they had a recommendation for a safe trip, but you in the driver's seat decided to ignore that. So then that turned into this tension. And because the tension wasn't resolved early enough in the engagement, it turned into deeper frustration, which built all the way up until you had an argument. You have to be able to identify when the argument is happening, right? So that's an example of an unmet need and a misunderstood statement, right? The spouse that was in the passenger seat was really just trying to make sure that you understood that there was a safe way, another way, an alternate way, whatever it may be, but it wasn't acknowledged. As soon as you acknowledge that, then you can move on. But if you push it to the side, well, that's going to make anyone feel like they're unheard. So guess what? They're going to probe again until they are acknowledged that they've been heard. So if you ever want to defuse a situation, just say, hey, you know what? You're right. Okay. Now, don't do that in a patronizing type of way. Do it in a genuine response type of way, right? Don't just say you're right just to shut a person up. That's not what I'm trying to teach here. What I'm trying to teach is acknowledging that when your spouse is trying to share something with you, that you should be prepared to respond to him or her in saying, hey, that's okay. You're right. And I could have done it that way. And just move on from there. Because once that happens, they'll say, okay, most of the time. Now, sometimes, there are some men and women out there, husbands and wives, that they love to nag. And I hate to use the term nag because that gets like a bad rap, but they love to continue to poke and push because they'll say, yeah, you see? And then that's going to take you potentially and start to make you feel a little bit jaded by the situation because you were trying to diffuse it, but that could be your ignition. Now, not going to be covered in this episode. However, know what triggers you and know when your spouse is triggering you. So then you can tell your spouse, like, hey, you got to calm down because that's not necessary. And make sure that your spouse knows that when you say calm down, that's not necessary. That's you telling them, hey, you're starting to trigger me. And this is going to lead to an argument, all right? Or some unwanted conversation or whatever, some frustration, right? We want to avoid them as much as we can. Now, this isn't me saying that we need to avoid conflict, all right? Because guess what? When you are telling your spouse, hey, that's triggering me, that's not you avoiding conflict. That's you confronting it, saying, hey, this is where this is going right now. We need to figure out a way to level the playing field and even things out, not have that problem, right? So hopefully that made sense. So the two things at the bottom of an argument are one, a unmet need, and two, a severe misunderstanding, both of which can be identified when it's happening. So now let's shift gears a little bit and talk about when is it appropriate to argue and when is it not appropriate to argue. So the first, I want to cover the non-appropriate pieces first because I feel like this seems to be the norm in our society and culture, and I want to combat that. So it's not appropriate to have very heated arguments, all right? Like the ones that you and your wife are going to have elevated blood pressure because of the argument in front of your children, all right? Now, small disagreements like where you want to go eat dinner at, whatever. Those aren't going to cause big issues. But when you have a argument about finances, and that's really a trigger in your relationship, or maybe there was some adulterous behavior and you have that type of argument in front of your kids, especially if you're using a lot of profanity, my hope and prayer for you is that you don't use profanity, because you can communicate more effectively when you're not using profane language. Trust me on that. You will always deliver your message better when you don't use profane language. And when you limit it, your profane language, and you use different wording or phrasings, when you do have to use profane language, which I don't recommend and don't agree with, it will be more impactful, because that will show your level of frustration with the circumstance. But if all you do is use profanity, it's hard to tell where you really are, other than maybe your volume or whatever. So don't use profane language when you're arguing in front of children. All right. Don't use it at all, but definitely not in front of children, because it teaches them poor communication skills, and that's not cool. All right. Our children have enough problems in today's world. We don't need more issues, and we don't want to be the cause of those issues, right? Uh, the other time that it's probably not appropriate to argue is in front of other people that aren't a part of the situation. Okay? Let me explain. If you are out at a friend's house and something comes up, you don't need to argue there. It is surprising how many times I have witnessed arguments at friends' houses during a get together between a couple, and they just thought it was perfectly natural. And it's like, guys, go outside, go somewhere else, go have your argument somewhere else. Because one, there's the selfish mentality, right? You're ruining my time, killing my vibe. But two, I don't need to know all of your business and issues that you guys are having. That's for you guys to work through on your own. And, you guys come back composed and consolidated, right? That's how we should be, composed and consolidated when we're in company. Now, that's not me telling you to put on some sort of front. If there's a problem, there's a problem, but go address that problem privately, okay? Unless the problem is with someone else within that room or that setting, okay? And then the third place is just anywhere in public. You don't need to argue in public, all right? It makes people feel uncomfortable. You end up on somebody's social media getting made fun of anyway. And you usually never resolve an argument in public, especially the ones that I've seen, like watched a person getting cussed out, which was amazing to me that this person was completely oblivious of her surroundings, because it was, unfortunately, I don't know, it was a female talking to a male, and they seemed to be in a relationship. I could be misinterpreting that, but this was at a mall. She was just cussing him out and telling him how no good he was. So there you go. And those things, okay to have those discussions in a quiet space. All right. Now, when should you argue? Well, I just said it, in a quiet space. Probably one of the best places when it's just the two of you and you guys can really just let it out. Right. And I'm going to talk in a little bit about how you can argue fairly or fight fairly, but I just want you to know, when I say let it out, I do mean express yourself to the fullest extent possible, but I don't mean in any physical harm kind of way where, or belittling the other person. All right. What I mean by expressing yourself is not holding back how you feel, but finding a way to articulate it and let it be known. All right. Because things that are not put into the space for discussion cannot be resolved. So you have to put everything out, all right? And we're going to talk about this here in a second, but I just want to make that very clear that when I say let everything go, I don't mean, or fully express yourself, I don't mean in a physical kind of way. I don't mean it in a belittling kind of way to your spouse. I just mean let everything that is really bothering you that led to this argument, just let it all come out, all right? But only specific to that particular argument, okay? Don't bring in other issues from, 4 or 5 years ago. That's just not helpful. It really isn't. No matter, and that's more for my ladies that listen to this podcast. That is not helpful, okay? You will lose more arguments that way, or at least lose interest in from your husband in that argument when you bring up stuff from 5 years ago that has absolutely nothing to do with the argument that you're having at the moment. Because in his mind, you just got to understand where he's coming from. In his mind, if that had already been discussed and talked about, then that's already discussed, talked about, it's done. That's not a thing that we're going to bring up again. However, if it's something that you held on to for years, you have to know when to bring that up in the discussion. And you have to bring it up in a very artful kind of way, because the way that that gets delivered from something, years ago, that has to be delivered differently than something that is fresh, that has happened in the past couple months, weeks, days, hours, minutes, seconds, whatever, right? But you want to find a quiet place. You also want to argue when both of you have eaten. Don't argue on an empty stomach, right? I know that that sounds weird, but when you are hungry, your aggression levels go up, right? It's just the way that it is. Like, you are heightened. You want to be relaxed, calm, and collected whenever you enter into an argument, because most of the time you're already dreading the about to have an argument, right? And I get it. You can't always schedule an argument. That's just not how it works. You don't get to schedule an argument. But what you can do is say, okay, when you identify that there's an argument, say, hey, can we take a pause for a second and let's gather ourselves and then come back in 15 minutes, right? Because when you can do that and your wife agrees, right? And this is why this marriage success series is for both husbands and wives to listen together, because there has to be this level of agreement. So when you know that you are coming up on an argument, you can say, okay, hey, we're about to argue. Let's pause for a second here. And then let's gather. Let's talk with one another a little bit later. So how do you argue fairly? Step number one is both of you have to agree that you want to resolve this issue, all right? So before the argument begins, right? Because now we're starting to bring some structure, and anything that has structure can generate consistent outcomes. And that's what's important here. We want to generate a consistent outcome. So that way, every time that you have an argument, you're always getting to some form of resolution. So that way you guys can work things out that much more better. Now, the first step is you have to agree that you want to resolve the problem, okay? That's the first step. The second step is that you're not going to raise your voice. You can get passionate, you can get a little challenged, if you will, excited. That's what I want to say. You can get a little excited, but you're not going to raise your voice and you're not going to belittle your spouse. You're also going to agree to put everything out into this discussion. Anything and everything that's surrounded leading to this argument, you want to put that out. Now, keep it in mind, not pulling in stuff from years ago unless it's relevant to the discussion or the argument that you are having at the moment. All right. And then what you want to do, once all of that stuff is out, both of you have kind of said what you want to say. Now you want to calm down a little bit more and use one of the communication techniques like speaker listener. All right. The speaker listener technique, if you're not familiar, is one person has the floor and that person gets to say whatever they want to say in small segments. All right. Because you don't want to just word vomit because it's going to make it hard for the listener. And this is where being more articulate and able to communicate what it is that's going on is going to come into play. All right. So you say, okay, the speaker is going to share whatever small segments, small little nuggets there. And then the listener is going to paraphrase what the speaker just said. All right. This is important because remember, you already put everything out there. So you shouldn't be coming up with new things. But what you're going to do is find that when you have to re-articulate the way that you're saying it and the way that and how it makes you feel and things of that sort, you're going to articulate it a little bit more. Now, to keep the speaker listener technique fair, I would say the speaker should get no more than 5 rounds without passing the floor over to the listener. All right. Now, you could use anything as a mechanism to indicate who has the floor. So if you're watching the video version of this podcast, you'll see that I have a remote in my hand. I can say, okay, if I have the remote, that means that I'm the speaker. I have the floor, I can speak. And then my wife would be the listener. Once I get done with my 3 to 5 rounds, right? Or no more than 5 rounds. You could do it in 1 round if you feel like the paraphrase was well and the conversation is moving forward. Then what I'm going to do is pass this over to my wife. She'll take it and she now has the floor and I become the listener. All right. This is a great technique to learn active listening and articulate speaking and affectionate speaking with your spouse. You'll do this until your argument has settled. And remember, you've already let out all of your frustration earlier before you got to the speaker listener. Don't jump straight to the speaker listener. It's not going to work well. Okay. I know this. It's better to just let it out, fully express whatever the situation is, because when it's out, it can be discussed. But if you hold on to it, your spouse is not a mind reader. All right. For all my ladies out there, husbands don't know what you are thinking. Just because it makes rational sense to you doesn't mean that it logically has triggered, the same level of sense to your husband. So you want to make sure that whatever you have to say, you got to put out there. And then for all my husbands, make sure that whatever you have going on, because our wives aren't mind readers, we have to tell her things. All right. And assumptions are very, very dangerous. So don't leave anything open to assumption. All right. Tell your wife what's really going on and just say it in a loving way, but be very straight to the point. Okay. Say it in a loving way, but be straight to the point. So that way she knows. Now, if for whatever reason you guys can't figure out how to manage an argument, then this is where a mediator really needs to come in, because arguments should be managed between husband and wife fairly simple. However, sometimes the topic of discussion or the thing that led to the argument may require a third person to come in and just be like, hey, let me level the bubbles, level the playing field, and help you out as much as I can. All right. What I would recommend is that this person is like a mentor, a pastor, or a professional counselor. Don't go get your best friend, either of you, because one of those people is probably going to be biased. And here's the other issue, right? If you go get your best friend and your best friend sides with your wife or vice versa, your wife's best friend sides with you, there's going to be friction in that relationship, right? You don't want that problem. You don't want those problems. So instead, go and get a mediator who is neutral, who can hear both sides and help pull out the pieces that really need to be talked about, all right? And see it from a completely different view than husband and wife, right? Than the way that you see it versus the way that your wife sees it. It just helps out that much more to have a third person or a third party helping with that, all right? And remember, you're always working towards a resolution. I put that twice in my notes because I feel like you got to start at the beginning and maybe even revisit that somewhere in the middle of your argument and just say, okay, hey, how are we resolving this, right? Because the whole point of letting everything out was to hear what the problems are so then you can start coming up with solutions to resolve this, right? Now, at the end of an argument, you should recap with one another what that resolution is, because you should walk away with a resolution. Even if it's a temporary resolution, you should still walk away with a resolution. When you have that, recap it with your wife or with your husband. However, like as a couple, recap it because that's going to help you stay focused on what you're moving towards. So I went through a lot of different things. I talked about how to identify when you're about to go into an argument, when you should argue, where you should argue, how you should argue, and then ultimately coming to a resolution. All right. Now, if this is something that you are challenged with and you want a little bit more help, the Patreon community is going to be the place that you will be able to receive extra help. I'll be in there and you can pose questions and I will answer as many other questions as I possibly can, as well as there's going to be additional resources that you'll have access to. So those by themselves could be the thing that you need to help you overcome an argument. So if that's something you're interested in, check the show notes or description box, whatever your platform says it is, and click on that Patreon link and sign up today. If you got questions, email me, husbandcoach2020@gmail.com. I'd love to be able to help out. So until next time, I want you guys to find a way to love your wife every day.